Hello, good evening, welcome. This is Novara Live. I am Bastani. Tonight I'm joined by Tadhg, Hickey. Tadhg, how are we?
How's it going, Aaron? Not too bad, man. Just kind of slowly losing my mind like the rest of us, I suppose.
Well, for some of us, it's not slowly at all, actually, but maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later on. The last story tonight, I have to say, is rather strange. Coming up on tonight's show, massive anti-war protests are underway across Israel. The Office for National Statistics has found the average rent in England to be unaffordable. Author Sally Rooney has been reported to the police over her pledge to support Palestine Action. Stay tuned for all of that and more. If you'd like to support our work here at Novara Media, you know what to do. You can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And of course, make sure to let us know your comments here in the YouTube chat, or otherwise just tweet at us or at me using the hashtag Novara Live. Last night, Volodymyr Zelenskyy and key European allies sat down with Donald Trump to discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine, just one day after the US president's meeting with Russian leader Vladimir Putin. In attendance were British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, French President Emmanuel Macron, Italy's Giorgia Meloni, and Finland's Alexander Stubb, along with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen. And they seem to have decided in advance that when it comes to Trump, flattery will indeed get you absolutely everywhere. Here's a compilation of European leaders doing some grade A fawning.
I really want to thank you, President of the United States, dear Donald, for the fact that you, as I said before, broke the deadlock.
Something is changing, something has changed, thanks to you.
In relation to a conflict which has gone on for 3 and a bit years, and so far nobody's been able to bring it to this point, so I thank you for that.
Pure hypocrisy. Just my view anyway. So what was the outcome of the multilateral summit, described by some observers as the fastest organised piece of transatlantic diplomacy since the run-up to the invasion of Iraq? Here's Starmer vlogging from the British Embassy.
So back at the British Embassy now after a long day, but a good day and a productive day, because both of the outcomes that we, the United Kingdom, most wanted, we've moved forward in a material way. And there was a real sense of unity between the European leaders that were here today and President Trump and President Zelenskyy. And 2 big outcomes, a breakthrough when it comes to security guarantees, with now the coalition of willing countries, that's the 30 or so countries that we've been coordinating for some months on security guarantees, now working with the US at pace to work up those security guarantees. These guarantees will ensure that if there is a peace, if there is a deal, then we hold to it and there isn't further conflict. So really important for Ukraine, really important for Europe, and really important for the United Kingdom as well. That's why it was an outcome we really wanted to achieve today. The second is that there will now be a bilateral meeting between President Putin and President Zelenskyy after a phone call by President Trump during the course of this afternoon to President Putin, followed by a trilateral meeting with President Trump as well.
Russia has not yet confirmed that it's ready to take part in a trilateral meeting with Trump and Zelenskyy. One of the major takeaways from yesterday's summit was that Trump has revised his position when it comes to the necessity of a ceasefire. This is the moment when Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz raised the issue of a ceasefire.
And to be honest, we all would like to see a ceasefire, the latest from the next meeting on. I can't imagine that the next meeting would take place without a ceasefire. So let's work on that and let's try to put pressure on Russia, because the credibility of these efforts we are undertaking today are depending on at least a ceasefire from the beginning of the serious negotiations from next step on. So I would like to emphasize this aspect and would like to see a ceasefire from the next meeting, which should be a trilateral meeting wherever it takes place.
Well, we're going to let the president go over and talk to the president, and we'll see how that works out. And if we can do that, I will say, and again, I say it, in the 6 wars that I've settled, I haven't had a ceasefire. We just got into negotiations, and one of the wars was, as you know, in the Congo was 31 years long. Another one that we settled last week with 2 great countries was 35 years going on, and we had no ceasefire. So if we can do the ceasefire, great. And if we don't do a ceasefire, because many other points were given to us, many points were given to us, great points.
Trump there in regards to the second conflict, of course, referring to Azerbaijan, Armenia. So clearly he's not fussed about a ceasefire. He wants a peace deal negotiated while the war rages on, which is certainly happening, with Russia launching the month's biggest overnight attack after Trump met Zelenskyy and his European allies. Perhaps Trump has jettisoned the idea of a ceasefire because he came away from the previous day's summit with Putin without any agreement for a ceasefire. Although Trump was caught yesterday on a hot mic saying this to Emmanuel Macron.
Yeah, to set up a trilateral. Yes.
And where do you want to do?
I think he wants to. I think he wants to make a deal for me. You understand that? As crazy as it sounds. Just sit down. Sit down, everybody.
Another controversial factor is Trump's approach to Ukraine ceding territory to Russia. He made these remarks before yesterday's summit.
We also need to discuss the possible exchanges of territory, taking into consideration the current line of contact. That means the war zone, the war lines that are pretty obvious, very sad, actually, to look at them.
Zelenskyy seems reluctant, understandably, to give up territory to Russia, and we don't yet know what that will look like. But the Times has published a number of graphics to show 4 options featuring territories like the Donetsk and Luhansk, known collectively as the Donbass, as well as Zaporizhia and Kherson, which are likely to feature in negotiations. Option 1, in orange, is the preferred European outcome, according to the Times, involves a ceasefire along the current front line. Option 2, in yellow, shows Russia getting the whole of the Donbass, which includes Donetsk and Luhansk. Option 3, in purple, would see Russia claim all of the Donbass, plus the Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. Very controversial because they don't have those. Russia has never controlled the latter 2 cities, despite signing declarations annexing them in 2022. In option 4, red and yellow, Putin gets the Donbass and Zaporizhia, but Ukraine takes back the whole of the Kherson region. In every scenario envisaged here, Russia gets Crimea. Now, Trump may have promised that the US will be involved in security guarantees for Ukraine, but today he also ruled out the possibility of American boots on the ground. Here's the president calling in to Fox News and Friends.
What kind of assurances do you feel like you have that going forward and, past this Trump administration, it won't be American boots on the ground defending that border?
Well, you have my assurance, and I'm president, and I'm just trying to stop people from being killed, Charlie. Look, they're losing from 5,000 to 7,000 people a week.
So if there are boots on the ground in service of Ukrainian security, presumably they'll need to come from the so-called coalition of the willing in Europe. Here's Pensions Minister Torsten Bell fielding questions on the possibility of British armed forces being among those boots this morning.
Sorry to go back to this. Is the UK saying we are ready and willing to put boots on the ground if that is necessary?
Well, the Defence Secretary has said we'd be prepared to have British soldiers in Ukraine, but we're not talking about that at this stage. What we're talking about is needing to move forward with what has been an accelerated process of talks in recent weeks. That's a good thing because ultimately we all want to see an end to the violence.
For those watching, by the way, let me know, put it in the comments. Do you think that British soldiers should be stationed in Ukraine as part of a broader negotiated peace deal? Maybe you do. Maybe you think it's a great idea. We should do our bit. Let me know. Maybe you think it's a terrible idea. No more forever wars. Again, let me know. Put that in the comments in the chat. The defence chiefs of all 32 NATO countries are expected to meet virtually tomorrow to discuss diplomatic efforts to secure peace in Ukraine. The security guarantees from Trump, whatever they may entail, have not yet been formalised, although Zelenskyy reckons they could be, quote, in the next week or 10 days. Trump also had some slightly stronger words for his Russian counterpart earlier today. This is from his Fox News call-in.
No, I thought I'd do first let them meet. They haven't been exactly best friends. They haven't gotten along very well. And I called President Putin yesterday, and I do have a good relationship, but it's only matters if we get things done. Otherwise, I don't care about the relationship. I do have a good relationship with him, but I want to get things done. I've solved 7 wars. We ended 7 wars. I thought this would be one of the easier ones, and this has turned out to be the toughest one. India, Pakistan, these were big ones. And also, all big ones, and some going for 31, 32 years, one for 35 years. The Congo, think of that, the Congo and Rwanda for 35 years. I got that one done. I got them all done, but this one is the one that is the most difficult, and I thought it would be an easy one. So I hope President Putin is going to be good, and if he's not, it's going to be a rough situation. And I hope that Zelenskyy, President Zelenskyy, will do what he has to do. He has to show some flexibility also. The thing is a mess. This was started by Joe Biden.
Vladimir Putin engages in whatever your views on this more broadly. It's an illegal war of aggression. And of course, Donald Trump manages to blame Joe Biden. You can say that the State Department was asleep at the wheel, or they encouraged the Ukrainians to do certain things. I'd be quite sympathetic to that. Joe Biden, however, didn't start the war. I mean, bear in mind, the occupation of Crimea is in 2014. Joe Biden isn't the president in 2014. Tadhg, before I come to you, we have now got that poll up. Should British armed forces be involved in Ukraine with boots on the ground? What do you make of this? We've been here before, it feels, with regards to negotiations, but this time does feel a bit different because there seems to be some movement on concessions from the European side. They sound rather different to the obstructionist rhetoric of what we were hearing maybe a year ago, 18 months ago. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I bow to people like John Mearsheimer from the realist perspective, and he would still say that the sides are still so far apart that he would see kind of reconciliation as still being quite far away. But what's very clear, I think, watching the kind of histrionics and the theatrics of the last few days is Europe, I think, in spite of the show of strength or the supposed show of strength, it just looks so weak now. It just looks so weak that it's, as you showed in your clip, that people are just queuing up to suck up to this kind of nonsense character, like, Dear Donald. I think Mark Rutte's Dear Donald just summed up the kind of almost laughable, sycophantic display. And it's the whims of Donald Trump, I suppose, that has moved the dial a little bit. But I mean, we'll obviously get on to Gaza later, but when you look at Gaza and you look at this particular conflict, it seems like Europe is just such a small player now in the great scheme of things. And I think the Russians know that. And I think Trump knows that. And I feel like Trump just wants to get it done. He doesn't really care either way. He's looking for that seventh conflict that he sorted out seemingly on his own. He's just started sorting out all these conflicts. But I think the other thing that we've learned in the last few days as well is that Putin, whatever you say about him, he's an old, masterful tactician, and he's made Trump look a little bit silly. And I think that forced Europe into this supposed show of strength. But there's that iconic image of Trump sitting at his desk and Europe lined up as kind of naughty school kids about to hear how long they're going to be in detention for. I think it's ultimately kind of backfired in this attempt to still look mean and strong and significant.
Yeah, maybe we can get that image up of Trump almost telling off those European leaders. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. You hear about the G7, the G8, some of the largest economies in the world. Yes, of course, the US and China by far the two largest economies in the world. But the G8 is also meant to include France, the UK, Italy, Germany. These are major economies with major industrial prowess historically, and they're nowhere to be seen. I mean, two of them are nuclear powers, of course, the UK and France. And yet, like you say, Tadhg, they're being told what to do by the school bully, Donald Trump. And it does really look like Europe is irrelevant. There was a great tweet, actually, accompanying that image, saying that this is the beginning of Europe's century of humiliation. I would actually say we're probably about 15 years into it, 20 years into it. I mean, goodness me. You had Nord Stream, right? We're pretty sure the CIA or the Ukrainians blew up Nord Stream with the assistance of the CIA. The literal former foreign minister of Poland thanked the White House on X, okay? So that's a multi-billion pound piece of infrastructure guaranteeing energy flows into Europe, which, by the way, is still happening. We are still importing more energy in terms of dollar value from Russia than we are sending as aid, I believe, to Ukraine. That was destroyed. This multi-billion-dollar investment, the anchor in terms of future French and German energy security with regards to energy coming from Russia, Austria to a lot of Eastern and Central Europe. Obviously, the French use a lot of nuclear, but they use some oil and gas as well. This would have been a huge, huge deal, and it was destroyed. And the Europeans said absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. No. We have been locked out of the future, and this continent of 450 million people has basically no role on the global stage. It's quite extraordinary, especially when you put it into counterpoint with Israel, a country of 10 million people. A country of 10 million people seemingly has more influence on global affairs than a continent of almost 500 million people. How did that happen? Again, let me know what you think. We've still got that poll going on in regard to British troops in Ukraine. We won't have another poll going up tonight. How did that happen? That's one of the major questions of our time. How did European political, economic, and cultural power decline so much so quickly? Israel has been rocked by major anti-war protests over the past few days. Protesters demanding an end to the conflict and the return of Israeli captives blocked the highway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on Sunday. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis went on strike from work and joined marches across the country in what was described as a, quote, day of stoppage. Some counts put the number of protesters at 400,000, while others have the turnout as high as over 2 million. Supporters of Israeli hostage families called the day of strikes and marches, and the numbers turning out demonstrates a growing urgency among Israelis who want the war to end and the 20 remaining hostages who are alive to be returned. Speaking to a crowd in Tel Aviv, Einav Zankoya, the mother of one of the hostages, said, quote, the Israeli government has transformed a just war into a pointless war. This was Netanyahu's response to the weekend's protests. The people who are calling today for the war's end without Hamas's defeat are not only toughening Hamas's stance and distancing our hostages' release, in the case of some of them their own children, they are also ensuring that the atrocities of October 7th will recur time and again, and that our sons and daughters will have to fight time and again in an endless war. Isn't his son in Miami? Maybe I'm wrong. Videos circulating on social media show huge crowds outside the headquarters of Netanyahu's Likud party over the weekend, fires being set by protesters, and, as you can see in the clip on screen, police officers violently shoving and dragging protesters. However, many remain undeterred, and demonstrations have continued today, with Israelis blocking the Ayalon highway in Tel Aviv. Here's what one protester told Reuters.
We started on Sunday stopping Israel in order to bring our hostages back. We find that the only thing that works is putting pressure on the Israeli government to make a deal, to seal the deal and bring all of our hostages back and stop the war in Gaza. We will not stop until all our hostages are home.
Last month, polling from Israeli Channel 12 showed that a clear majority of Israelis, including 60% of those who voted for Netanyahu's coalition, want a war-ending deal that releases all Israeli captives in one go. Only 12% of those surveyed rejected any deal that would end the war, and nearly 50%, half, said Netanyahu's insistence on a phased hostage return deal was for, quote, political reasons. However, this doesn't mean that Jewish Israelis extend much sympathy to Palestinians being bombed and starved on the other side of the apartheid wall. A survey from the Israel Democracy Institute a few weeks ago asked Israeli Jews, quote, to what extent are you personally troubled or not troubled by the reports of famine and suffering among the Palestinian population in Gaza? 79%, over three quarters, were not that troubled or not troubled at all. They also said they believe the Israeli military is doing enough to avoid unnecessary suffering. Arab Israelis took the opposite view, with 86% being very or somewhat troubled by reports of famine and suffering in Gaza. The ongoing protests today come after reports that Hamas has agreed to a 60-day ceasefire proposal with Israel. This includes the return of half the Israeli hostages held in Gaza and Israel's release of some Palestinian hostages. The latest proposed ceasefire has been brokered by Qatar and Egypt, and both countries have confirmed Hamas's agreement. Israel has not yet formally responded, but says it will do so by Friday. But in the context of this being just a week after Israel's war cabinet voted to fully occupy Gaza City and forcibly displace its population, a war crime under international law, it seems pretty clear what Tel Aviv's preferred endgame is. Netanyahu reportedly wants the entirety of Gaza under Israeli control by the 7th of October, and his administration has laid out its plans to confine surviving Palestinians into a concentration camp, only allowed to leave if they agree to abandon their homeland in its entirety. In other words, a quasi-voluntaristic form of ethnic cleansing. Since dawn today, Israeli forces have reportedly killed at least 40 Palestinians in an ongoing genocide that has killed a conservative estimate of 62,000 Palestinians, including 18,000 children. Of course, it may be many, many, many more than that. Tadhg, what do you make of these protests? Because, of course, they're not necessarily favourable to what's going on in Palestine. The overwhelming majority of Jewish Israelis couldn't care less about what's happening there. They think how their army is behaving is appropriate. However, it's a pretty clear rejection of Netanyahu's government, specifically its conduct over the last 18 months in this war. You have so many people out on the streets and so many people, when they're polled, saying things which frankly mean they don't trust their government. How should we read that? Because generally speaking, a rule of thumb is in conflict and war, countries rally around the flag, they rally behind the leader. That seems to be disintegrating in Israel right now.
Like anything that hastens the killing, I think, is to be welcomed. But, you know, the main thing I took from the whole thing was how well Zionists are organized, that they can effectively bring their economy to a standstill. So, as you quite rightly point out, not so much so that they can stop the mass murder and starvation of Palestinians, but that no more Israelis get caught up in as Israel proceeds to the latter stages of its genocide and ethnic cleansing. So I was actually in a weird way impressed, if that doesn't sound too bizarre, by how well they organized, got buy-in from all sectors of society. As you say, the figures are anything up to maybe 500,000 to 1 million people involved in these mass protests. And I thought, you know, if this, for me, what is a complete psychopathic state at this point, or at least exhibiting many signs of psychopathy, if they can rally around so effectively, they're baby killers. Like, surely we should be doing so much more here in the West to rally round and offer solidarity to the babies, to the men, to the women who are being killed and starved as we speak right now. By the time this transmission ends, more people will have been killed in Palestine. So, you know, and actually quick plug on that. So this Thursday, the 21st of August, people that I'm working with have organized a global boycott. And I think we need to take a leaf out of Israel's book. You know, they are very good at kind of organizing, and I think we need to be stronger in our governments. You know, another thing I was thinking recently is, you know, you get this thing in Ireland where you say like the Irish government is complicit or the British government is complicit, but it's much stronger than that. I mean, it's obviously much more strong in Britain than it is in Ireland, but we're assisting. You know, a friend of mine in Galway said we're assisting a genocide. That would be the first time in Irish history, for instance, that we would be guilty of assisting a genocide. And with that in mind, I feel like the entire economic system in this part of the world should have been brought to its knees a long time ago. People should be on the streets right now. I mean, the word complicit is vague. I think assisting is a little bit strong. So yeah, you've got to hand it to them. They're very good at organizing, and their rallies are effectively to bring down the Netanyahu government. Let's remember they were rallying to bring down Netanyahu long before October 7th. So they're engaging in these protests for over 2 years. They're well organized, they're determined, and we need to take a leaf out of their book.
And I'm curious what you make of the point that's made by Ilan Pappé, Tadhg, which is that the biggest threat to Israel, whatever one's views about how, you know, the West should respond to what's going on or how it should relate to Israel more generally. You're wearing a anti-Zionist social club t-shirt there, I think, so people know what you think. But what Ilan would say, well, regardless of boycotts or sanctions or divestment, all of which he supports, the number one threat to Israel actually is this schism within Israeli civil society of liberal Zionists going on a completely different political trajectory to the more religious fundamentalist parts of that society. Everything from birth rates to the role of religious scripture in making domestic laws. Effectively, he says you're looking at the growth, the development of two different countries, the land of Israel and what he calls the land of Judea, this even more murderous, ultranationalist sort of state entity. What do you make of that?
I mean, Yeah, I mean that's such an interesting point, and Gideon Levy has also made the point that like the idea of liberal Zionism is kind of a little bit ludicrous when all sectors of society, no matter where they stand, they all seem to be okay with the occupation. You know, you could almost argue that the occupation of Palestine and that's continuation and the continuation of the apartheid system is kind of the only thing that binds this disparate, fractured society. I mean, that's a really dark claim to make, but it feels right. That's the one thing they can agree on is we are not getting off this stolen land. We can disagree on religion, we can disagree on how you function your society, but the one thing is for sure, we're staying and expanding actually on this stolen land that we've taken. So I think if you took Palestine out of the equation, you probably would have an awful lot of fracturing right now. And I think people who know an awful lot more about it than me would say that you've got all the ingredients for a civil war. But actually this kind of animosity, this hatred towards Arabs, I mean, it's laughable that you always hear from the Israeli side that Palestinians need to learn not to bring up their kids to hate. And actually the opposite is true. Just like every single Zionist talking point, the opposite is always true. Every accusation is a confession. There's a deep-seated inbuilt hatred towards Palestinians that kids are taught from a very young age. Otherwise, how on earth could we be talking about 79%, 80% of the Israeli population don't care? They don't care that people are dying, being mass murdered and starved to death just over the wall from them. I mean, that for me is a society that in many ways can't really be reformed. You'd have to break up that country and start again. You'd have to end the occupation. You'd have to end the apartheid. That's the real thing. And that's why I think it's laughable. And we need to always call it out when we get people in this part of the world saying, it's just Netanyahu, it's just Ben-Gvir. If we just sanction these few people, that will get rid of that'll be the boil that we will have kind of lanced. It's a deep, intrinsic thing. And people like Ilan Pappé and Gideon Levy have been screaming this at us for a long time, that it's an endemic thing in Israeli society and it's not going away with removing one supposedly uniquely evil leader.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to you, Tadhg, because I actually agree with that. I think Ilan, empirically, when he talks about the growth of effectively two different kinds of society, I think he's right. And I think it's absolutely a threat to the stability of the Israeli project. And I agree with you that it has all the ingredients, all the makings of a civil war in historical context. But I think you are right. The fact that the role of the Palestinian other is so strong and so fundamental to the Israeli identity is the thing that is stopping that, right? And so, if anything, the political incentives are very high to lean into ever greater hatred of Palestinians, precisely to mitigate, if nothing else, besides the occupation project and the expansionist project, which is, like you say, pretty core to all of this too. But even just to mitigate that stuff politically, you'd want to lean into hatred of Palestinians ever more. I think you make a really persuasive argument against Zionism. I personally agree. I don't think this is an issue of this politician can go and then everything's fine. I think there are deep flaws, to put it lightly, within the Israeli state as it exists, as it has always existed, as an expression of an intellectual project that cannot be resolved with it as it stands. Now, of course, under some definitions of anti-Semitism, that makes me an anti-Semite. I simply refute that. I don't think that's the case whatsoever. However, that anti-Zionism for a pretty long time was an intellectual critique. I feel like over the last 2 years, Tadhg, more and more people have been exposed to that thinking. At the same time, they're seeing tens of thousands of people being murdered, their homes destroyed. The Gaza Strip looks like Dresden, London, and Hamburg combined times 10. Do you think that intellectual critique is now becoming far more common sense to large numbers of people in places like Ireland and the UK?
Yeah, I've always felt, that the longer a so-called war goes on, the worse it is for Zionists, the worse it is for Zionism. And I mean, they were pretty expert at having what they would describe horrifically as mowing the lawn expeditions in Gaza, where they just kind of let you know who's boss. They get in, they murder a lot of people, they take out a few targets, they bomb a few buildings, and then just as we're all getting really worked up about it, they move out again. And we've had these kind of debates for the however long it goes on. Usually the conversations start with the first Hamas rockets and never look at the core cause. What has gone on this time is more people, just regular folk, they're not lefties, they're not even particularly politically engaged, have just done a little bit more reading, and they've looked into the causes and conditions. And then, as you say, what's new this time is that it's ineluctable. The images that we see on our phones, on our TV screens, are so strong, are so emotive. Even recently, I think, if you look at people in Ireland and Britain, particularly looking at images of children, particularly children starving to death, like that recalls all the horrors that everyone agrees on. Famines in Africa from the 80s and 90s. It's the kind of thing that, and that's why, you know, I cynically refer to it as the Bob Geldof metric in one of my videos, that, you know, Bob Geldof came into the conversation at that point. And to be honest, anybody who's coming into the conversation is welcome. But he did use that moment because I think there was something about it that almost hit home for him as well. And you have ordinary people who aren't that engaged going, well, if Bob Geldof's talking about it, it's now kind of a thing. But to go back to your point, the images are so undeniable. There's a longer stretch where people are looking into it. And I've always believed that if you see the irrefutable imagery in front of you, and if you look into Zionism and where it started, you cannot but come out on the side of the Palestinians. And that doesn't mean that you hate Jews. That doesn't even mean necessarily that you don't want to see a state of Israel. But what it definitely means is you cannot support the apartheid. Just as you would never have supported in South Africa, you can't support it in Israel. You can't support the expansion of settlements. And you need to speak up for Palestinian human rights on a very basic level. And I would say liberation as well. So I think Israel has a major problem on its hands that we can't unsee now what we've seen. We can't unread what we've read. And if you do that work, I don't think there's any going back. You cannot live with Israel as it is right now going forward.
I agree with all of that. I think lots of people who aren't necessarily that familiar with the topic, they watch or listen to conversations like this, or they see protests, and they think, well, look, lots of bad stuff happens in the world, and this is bad. It shouldn't be happening. But why do they talk about this bad thing rather than all the other bad things? And I think, look, at Novara Media, we could always have broader coverage of all the awful things that happen in the world. Of course we could. What makes this specific, though, and of huge importance, is twofold. Firstly, the state of Israel is literally founded upon displacing, back in 1948, you know, the best part of 750,000 people. That process is still happening today. So it's a project of displacement by design. That's the first point. Secondly, unlike the UK or France or the US, this is a state which necessarily has to be a state which is a majority Jewish state. And it will have failed in its design as a state if that is never the case. Okay? And that is going to mainstream all kinds of horrific conversations in our own countries. So Israel is actually a very unique place. It's not, you know, a normal country which has done some bad things, and if some of the politicians go, then everything will be fine. No. The project itself, the intellectual antecedents before it, going all the way back to the mid-19th century, even earlier than that, are deeply troublesome, are deeply dysfunctional. And I think if the collective West doesn't start to criticize this, doesn't start to say, actually, if you believe in the values of human equality, equality under the law, the Enlightenment, if you believe in these things, you need to have that critique of Israel. It has implications for us here at home as well. Although, of course, that shouldn't be why you're moved to action. 18,000 children dying, minimum, should be enough. But this is such a totemic issue, conflict, moment, event. Like I say, it goes back all the way, really. You could say 1948, you could say the 1920s, you could say 1917, Balfour Declaration. That is definitional for how the world, I think, is going to play out over the rest of the 21st century. I care about that because that's the world that my daughter and hopefully other children and grandchildren are going to grow up in. And I want to do my best to ensure that it doesn't go down a very dark path. Do you own a home or do you rent? If you're in the latter camp, what percentage of your income goes on rent at the end of each month? If that figure is below 30%, well done. The Office for National Statistics classifies your rent as affordable. Above 30%, and it's unaffordable for you. Furthermore, an area is considered affordable if the average private renting household would spend the equivalent of 30% or less of their gross income on rent. If your town or city is above 30%, the area has unaffordable rents below, and they're affordable. Arbitrary, I know. What if I'm at 29 or 31%, you might be saying? Nevertheless, these are quite useful ways of measuring something that's really important, especially as those in the private rental sector have substantially increased over the last 2 decades. Renting from a private landlord is more common than at any point in the post-war era. Yesterday, the Office for National Statistics released the data about rental affordability for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland in 2024. Its main findings were this. Private renters on a median household income could expect to spend 36.3% of their income on an average price rented home in England, compared with 25.9% in Wales and 25.3% in Northern Ireland in 2024. In other words, the average rent in England is unaffordable. The rent is too damn high. In Wales and Northern Ireland, generally speaking, that isn't the case. And interestingly enough, Wales is becoming more affordable over time. Maybe you're Welsh, maybe you live in parts of Wales and don't think that's the case. Maybe you think the ONS is wrong. Let me know. There are some exceptions, of course, in Wales as well. Then there's this. Private rental affordability has fluctuated since 2016, but remained above the 30% affordability threshold in England, while it moved below the threshold over time in Wales to reach similar levels to Northern Ireland. Private rental households' incomes have increased faster than rents in all 3 countries since 2016. But since 2021, as rents started increasing more rapidly, Gary Stevenson talks about this a lot post-COVID, different patterns emerged with incomes increasing faster than rents in England, but increasing slower than rents in Wales and Northern Ireland. Here's the detail about where it is most unaffordable in England. Surprise, surprise, it's London. London's private rental affordability ratio was 41.6% in 2024. 41.6%. Like I said, if it's above 30, that's unaffordable. Keeping England's affordability ratio above the 30% affordability threshold, despite most English regions being below the threshold. In England and Wales, 2/3 of local authorities, 68%, had an average rent that was below the affordability threshold in 2024, similar to the previous year. In other words, London is massively weighting the national data towards unaffordability, with the local authorities with the least affordable rents all in London. Meanwhile, the least affordable authorities outside of London were predictably urban centres like Bristol, Bath, North East Somerset, Brighton and Trafford, or areas with high numbers of commuters going to London like Watford and Sevenoaks. Now, I noticed an interesting pattern when I was going through all of those. Most of those places are run by Labour. Here's a helpful map that the ONS made. The darker areas are the more unaffordable parts of the country. So basically, there are real issues in all of London and the South East, as well as Bournemouth, Bath, Bristol, Greater Manchester, Leeds, York, and the Vale of Glamorgan and Cardiff. Like I say, not all of Wales is affordable. All of those places I just mentioned, as far as I remember, have Labour MPs. Now, some quite expensive places don't. The Cotswolds is also, unsurprisingly, not affordable. But by and large, these are Labour seats where renters vote for Labour. So it's probably not good that 3 of the 5 largest landlords in Parliament are Labour MPs, or that the Minister for Homelessness until a few weeks ago, Rushanara Ali, was a rogue landlord, or that Jazz Atwell, the Labour MP for Ilford South, is a slum landlord whose tenants have to put up with infestations of ants and black mould. You can't be taking seats where rents are disproportionately high and renters vote for you for granted, or at least you'd think not. I wrote about all of this in a piece for the New Statesman yesterday. Labour has become the party of landlordism. That's because it is. At least I think so. If you rent and are watching this live, let me know what you think. Has the experience of renting improved in the last 12 months with Keir Starmer in number 10? I don't think so. Is it better in local authorities run by a Labour council? Again, I'm not so sure. I've seen no evidence of that, but I'd love to be wrong. Tadhg, there is a rental crisis in Ireland too. It's worse than Britain. I think this is really lost on lots of people here in England. What's going on in places like Dublin is just extraordinary, actually. I mean, it puts London in the shade, which really takes some doing. How central has that crisis become in the Irish political debate?
Yeah, I'd actually be really interested in terms of your viewers. Is the same thing happening in London, for instance? So in Ireland, like, just to make it all about me for a second, as an artist, musicians, actors, comedians and whatnot, you're getting a really big thing in Dublin, particularly Cork a little bit, but it's mostly Dublin, as you say, where people just can't afford to live there anymore. So like the cultural life of the city is being completely gutted. People can't afford to rent. They can't afford to, obviously they can't afford to buy. That's laughable in Ireland, in Dublin particularly. But they can't afford to even, rent out studios to rehearse or make art or whatnot. So I think like the long-term effects, people don't really go to Dublin to visit hotels or data centers. Like you would imagine that people are attracted to Ireland because hopefully of our culture and arts and music and the people and whatnot. So that's a really big thing that's happening from the artist perspective. And I'd love to know, because I don't know as much about Britain. Is that a thing in London? And I've got some mates in Manchester, and I think they can still afford to live there as artists. So is that a thing in London? And yeah, this is a huge issue in Ireland. There was a general election in 2020, for instance, which was the major swing in Sinn Féin's popularity in the south of Ireland, for instance. And a lot of people from the outside were interpreting it as this mad rush towards Irish republicanism and Irish unity. And that's a factor, certainly. But actually, the voting public are just so sick of the two ruling parties in Ireland prioritizing corporate greed over social and affordable housing, that there was a big swing towards Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin's got a superb housing spokesman by the name of Owen O'Brien, who's published works on housing and the causes and conditions. But it's pretty much the same thing as you get in Britain, which is just basically an obsession with the free market, a kind of a reluctance to really look at the importance of social and affordable housing as an actual good in and of itself, and just focusing on housing as a commodity. And that is something that is still massive in terms of the vote today. If there was a general election next week, I think that would still be the dominant issue. People try to put in other issues. They're kind of foisted in there, like immigration and whatnot, but housing is still the most important issue in Ireland right now. We've got a massive problem with, dilapidated, abandoned buildings as well, like all over Cork. That's a huge thing. Dereliction is a major, major problem here. And again, that's by design. That's a government policy design where they're just not tough on landlords. They're not tough on any of the corporations. And so the city centres, particularly in my city in Cork, slowly but surely you see new hotels opening up all the time. And again, like properties, housing in the city being gutted. No people are really going in town in the numbers that they did. And I'm just wondering, where is this all going? Are people going to come to Cork to go to the new, like, whatever it's called, Moxie Hotel or whatnot? Like, of course not. So yeah, let me know what's going on in Britain, guys. I'm eager to know.
What you're describing in Cork sounds very similar to Shoreditch 20 years ago, right? What made Shoreditch a little bit different was completely destroyed by these identikit corporate hotel chains. And in terms of artists and creatives, they are being pushed out of London, larger cities generally, but particularly London. Like you say, there are still these places around Greater Manchester you can kind of cling on. There's a good public transport infrastructure by English standards anyway, where you can move around the Greater Manchester area. Liverpool, it should be said, is still quite affordable. It's below that 30% level, just. Leeds is above. So it's a bit of a mixed story. Liverpool, probably quite a good place to live if you're in your early 20s. Glasgow too. We've got the poll results for should Britain send armed troops to Ukraine as part of a broader deal, should be added. 78% say no, 22% say yes. I obviously think no. It's my personal view. I think that's probably reflective of the country more generally. It might be slightly lower on the no, but I imagine it would still be a big majority for no in terms of boots on the ground. We've got a response from Darlene Haynes about my question regarding housing. I'm in a council flat. My rent went up by 100 quid over the past couple of years. When I moved in, it was £275. Privately, £500 a month for a bedsit. So that's mad. But I pay about 400 quid these days. Hysteria Lane 24. We're saving up to live in a van. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. Hysteria Lane, where do you live? We're saving up to live in a van. Very common. Very, very common. Very, very common. We also had a good one here. 10 years ago, my rent was 25% in terms of your take-home pay, your gross pay, I should say, rather. Now it's 50%. I've been living in the same rented flat in that time. I don't think the political class understand what this does to people. I don't think they understand. I mean, I wrote that article, and at the top of that article in the New Statesman, I said I've moved 15 times in 15 years. It gave me depression. It literally gave me depression. And I know this because within 6 weeks of moving home, I will never forget a moment where I just realized I felt completely different. I hadn't felt a certain kind of stress that I'd become so accustomed to for more than a month. And then it clicked. Housing security is absolutely everything, right? If you don't want people fly tipping, if you don't want people littering, and by the way, homeowners do that stuff too, of course. If you want people to have more trust in their neighbors, if you want people to shop local, if you want lower crime, whatever it is, Tory coded, left coded, whatever it is, greater housing security will only help. Will only help. The idea that people can be moved from pillar to post every year because we censor landlords and all that matters is them making more and more money, that is destroying so many places in this country, Ireland as well. Tadhg, I want to go back to you very quickly. Here's a question. Given the centrality of housing in Irish politics, more so than here, right? It seems to me anyway, maybe I'm wrong, but given the centrality of housing and the inability of the Irish state, the Irish government to actually solve this problem, surely it seems quite obvious that one of the major parties could do something a bit different. And, you know, they might actually get some political cachet for that. I mean, I know it sounds an obvious thing to say, but nobody appears to have tried doing it in the last 15 years. Apart from Sinn Féin or the Labour Party or the Greens or whatever, in terms of the big two, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, of those big two, are there any sort of, and I don't support either of them. If I was in Ireland, if I was an Irishman, I'd vote for Sinn Féin. Again, I like to be accountable and transparent with you guys. But of those two major parties, are there political figures or politicians who are actually saying, to you anyway, quite positive, productive things about how to solve the housing crisis?
The short answer is no. I mean, there's people who are kind of experts on this, like Owen O'Brien and Rory Hearn on the left in Irish politics, and they're looking at the new ideas coming from government, and there are no new ideas. And it speaks to the points that you made eloquently there, that the problem is from this government, and has been all previous governments, is that there's a fundamental disagreement on how they view housing. As you say, you know, someone like Owen O'Brien or like, you know, the likes of me would look at housing, as you say, as being bound up with all the other problems that we have in society. I mean, I have struggled with addiction and whatnot, and I have many friends who have addiction issues. I would say the number one contributing factor to people staying in addiction is that they don't have secure housing. You know, so that's just one mass. And obviously Ireland has famously got a lot of addiction issues. Not having social and affordable housing is exacerbating the addiction issues that we have in the country. And what the government do is they throw things like minimum pricing at the problem, as if, you know, if we sort out minimum pricing, make it more difficult for people to get alcohol, then it'll sort out alcoholism. As opposed, like, alcoholics, when they need alcohol, they're just going to get it at any price, even if they have to steal for it. So there hasn't been anything new from this government because, again, fundamentally, they look at housing as a commodity. They look at it as part of a free market, and they don't want to do anything to rock the boat with the landlords, the vulture funds, the corporations, often American, that kind of prop up the Irish economy, until they start looking at housing as something that's innately, inherently, intrinsically good and important for the morale and the spirit of a country. There won't be any significant changes, sadly.
Yeah, it is so important. It is so important. I mean, you know, what is the Labour Party going to seriously do about it when the homelessness minister, Rushanara Ali, is a rogue landlord? She was in breach of legislation that was implemented by the May government in 2019 in terms of charging the former tenants things that she shouldn't have been charging them for. You know, we have to get the Tories out to solve the housing crisis. No, we have the Labour Minister for Homelessness breaching legislation and regulations introduced by the literal Tories. Not good, is it? And then you've got, I think, two MPs between them, Jazz Atwall and another Labour MP for the West Midlands. He was formerly on the NEC. They're both in Labour First. Between them, they've got 20 rental properties. 20 rental properties. Are those people really going to understand the relationship between something that you just mentioned a moment ago, substance abuse or addiction issues, and housing security? Clearly, somebody who's trying to overcome those problems, whether they're in recovery for 1 month or 10 years, clearly housing security is going to be beneficial to them. Clearly. whatever it is, by the way, home ownership or secure tenure with regards to, social tenancy, or we have some solution in regards to bringing private rents down, or probably all three. Clearly. But I don't think it works for these guys. We have one more super chat before I go to the next story. £10, I think it is. Let me get this up on the channel anyway. Welsh rent reduction likely related to recently introduced second homes council tax being up to 300%, which has led to second home owners selling up. Gwyneth now also requires planning to change to second home. It works. That's really, really interesting. I'm going to look into that because, as I said at the top of this story, the data shows that Wales is actually becoming more affordable with regards to the average rent as a percentage of gross pay. Clearly something's causing that, right? What is it? And you guys are saying it's likely related to the second homes council tax and it being so high. I'm inclined to agree. Award-winning Irish novelist Sally Rooney has been reported to the police after an essay she wrote was published over the weekend. Writing in the Irish Times, Rooney stated that she will use the proceeds from her books and their BBC TV adaptations to support the recently proscribed direct action group Palestine Action. Here's an excerpt from that piece. If the British state considers this terrorism, then perhaps it should investigate the shady organisations that continue to promote my work and fund my activities, such as WH Smith and the BBC. And it didn't take long for the campaign against anti-Semitism to tweet that it had reported Rooney to UK counter-terror police. The campaign against anti-Semitism also told The Telegraph that it will pursue a private prosecution of Rooney if UK authorities fail to act. Where are they getting the money from? Where are they getting the money from to potentially curtail free speech in terms of criticising effectively the policies of a foreign entity, Israel? I know we're talking about Palestine Action, what's done in the UK, but private prosecution, that doesn't sound like anti-Semitism. That sounds like something quite different. Palestine Action was prescribed on the 5th of July under the 2000 Terrorism Act, putting it in the same category as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Being a member of or expressing support for the direct action group can carry a sentence of up to 14 years in prison. Since prescription, hundreds of peaceful protesters, including elderly and disabled people, have been arrested en masse under the 2000 Terrorism Act, most for holding signs like this. This morning, Lib Dem leader Ed Davey told BBC Breakfast that his party is troubled by those mass arrests. Here's what he went on to say.
Do the Liberal Democrats agree that Palestine Action should be a proscribed organisation?
Well, in the House of Commons, we abstained because we didn't think the government had made that case. We absolutely accept that criminal acts have happened against British military assets, and that's deeply worrying. And I'm willing to accept that there are things that the Home Secretary hasn't been able to unveil, but I'm afraid it's the job of a principled opposition to put pressure on the government to actually prove its case, and the government hasn't done that, which is why we took that action in Parliament. And it's why we're calling today, or have this week, for a review of the legislation. I think that's the principled and sensible and practical way of trying to deal with a difficult situation.
This is the lady that wrote Normal People. It was like the romantic literature that you could not miss on the London Underground 5-10 years ago. What's going on? Tadhg, we're in the foothills of this story. How's it being received so far in Ireland?
Well, we cleverly haven't prescribed Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation, so we're full up of our terrorist organisations over here, as you know, so we don't have room to add another one at the moment. We're just looking at the whole thing, just thinking it's just so ridiculous, and it feels like Britain is descending into farce in its kind of commitment to protect Israel and Zionism at all costs. And I would never encourage anybody to break the law under any circumstances, and I mean that actually, because why should anyone be prosecuted for a ridiculous reason? But I do think strength in numbers is the key out of this whole thing, but how we get out of it is to force the farce further and further until the whole thing is so ridiculous it breaks down. So one example for that would be, people smarter than I would say that 500 arrests a couple of weekends ago, then 60 arrests. This is not sustainable. If people keep getting arrested, there's nowhere to put them, and the judicial system in Britain will break down. I mean, there's an organised Palestine rally coming up. Again, I would never say that people should do this, but imagine if the minimum 80,000 people all had I Support Palestine Action t-shirts underneath their jumpers or jackets. For me, epitomises how the West generally, but maybe particularly Britain, is losing its mind and its soul in this, I think, completely pointless, futile attempt to save Israel from itself.
I mean, I was going to say that's all quite absurd. Of course, none of it scratches the surface compared to people being detained by the police. And I'm not making this up for wearing T-shirts that say Palestine Action. And I think you're right. This isn't just about the country looking ridiculous. It's about the soul of the country. It's about the soul of the country. And it's losing its soul. If you're now saying to foreign writers, and of course, Sally Rooney is based overseas, therefore, if she stays at home, she can't be arrested for this. If you're saying to foreign writers that if they express themselves saying a sentence, they will be arrested when they land in the UK, that is an extraordinary, extraordinary shift from normality. It just is. It just is. This is the country that prides itself on giving safe haven to Salman Rushdie after there was a fatwa put on his head by Ayatollah Khomeini. Basically, effectively a death sentence of sorts. And that became shorthand for how backwards my father's country, Iran, was at the time. Still is, right? You can agree or disagree with the fatwa or whatever. Doesn't matter. That became a center point in a sort of cultural understanding of why Iran wasn't like the UK, of why Iran, with the Islamic Republic, was no longer a place where human rights applied. Now, nobody is saying that we should be having the death sentence involved here for Sally Rooney. We don't have the death sentence in this country. I agree with us not having the death sentence, at least of all somebody saying I support an organization. However, it does seem like a major departure. This is now becoming normal, though. Really weird stuff is becoming normal. Last week, we had an exceptional video on our Instagram channel. We covered it here too on YouTube, of a Falklands veteran, a colonel, who was in the commandos, saying that it was a humiliation for this country that it's supporting genocide in Gaza. That man was arrested, I believe. He's mentioned in dispatches from the Falklands because of his bravery. Now, again, I'm not saying you have to love the British Army or support Britain in terms of the Falklands War or whatever. It's not normal for those kinds of people to be arrested for saying a sentence. And I feel like this is a real test about who actually cares about freedom of expression and who actually cares about Britain just being a non-insane country at this point. If I have a T-shirt saying, I support Palestine, comma, action is needed, that's not a criminal offense. If I move the comma one word, it's maximum 6 months in prison. I don't want my children to grow up in a country like that. That is such a regression on where we were 30 years ago. And when people were coming up with the Terrorism Act in 2000, you can read it in Hansard, these debates were had, will this legislation be used in such a way to undermine domestic dissent with regards to domestic organisations? Of course not. Of course not. We would never dream of doing that. Well, that's precisely what a Labour Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, and remember this legislation was introduced by a Labour government, has done. Tadhg, I had a few great comments actually saying that you should be doing this more regularly. I couldn't agree more. Do you have any final thoughts on the Sally Rooney story?
Yeah, well, I just was very interested listening to what you were saying there, and I was thinking to myself, and Britain is doing this for a foreign country. Like, it's tearing up its own kind of fabric of society, its own, international adherence to international law, its own morality, its own soul, as you said, and I agree with you. And it's not for itself. The government is not trying to protect itself. It's trying to protect another government. Like, it reminds me of the Bob Vylan Glastonbury fiasco, where shock horror punk band did something a bit punk-ish in a field, and the whole British establishment lost its mind. Whereas Bob Vylan was writing lyrics about the Queen and telling her to go do this and that and other to herself for years. Totally anti-establishment, anti-British authority. Not a peep. Nobody had any interest or problem with them whatsoever. But the moment that they spoke out against Israel, they were done. They were toast. So I just wonder, where are the British patriots? Where are the Tommy Robinson-isms? Well, obviously Tommy Robinson has got vested interest in this because of his attachment to Israel. But if I was a British first guy, if I was a British army guy, I'd be saying, why are we selling our souls? Why are we selling out what we supposedly value for this foreign entity that doesn't give a shit about us? So I call on the British nationalists. You traditionally have a great relationship with them, as you can imagine, to stand up and fight to take their country back from Tel Aviv rule.
It's a great point. We talked about this, I think, last week. There was a Labour backbench MP contacted the employer of a Labour member, a young Labour member, saying that they shouldn't be trusted because they wouldn't go on a trip to Israel. This is a Labour MP potentially destroying the career prospects of a young person in their own party because they won't go on a trip to a foreign country. Now, if I heard that in a foreign country, right? If somebody said to me, in Italy, there was this MP that did this because the kid wouldn't go on a trip to Israel, I would just presume the MP is an intelligence asset for Israel. I would just presume that. Which is pretty obvious, right? Why would you do that? What's in your rational self-interest to be doing that? Or maybe they're a lobbyist for Israeli interests, the MP that did that. Of course, we don't know which MP it was. You can use your imagination, though, can't you? Because it doesn't make any sense. I think it's such a great point. This isn't to defend, some colonial nostalgia for Britain. I wouldn't agree with that, but at least, again, it would be comprehensible. This is literally batting for a foreign country. The British police could potentially arrest Sally Rooney for a foreign country. We're in very strange times, people. But you will always, always, always make sure, I hope, to be on the right side of the debate. We'll try that too here at Novara Media. Thanks, Tadhg, for joining me tonight.
Pleasure. Thanks, buddy.
And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.